My name is Naomi Clark. I am 68 years old, a retired high school librarian who once believed my quiet life by the sea would be the final chapter of peace I had worked so hard to earn. I kept my routines like cherished books on a shelf. Morning tea in my silver pot, walks through the garden, Daniel and I planted together, evenings with my reading lamp glowing over old photographs. It was not a glamorous life, but it was mine. And then, 1 week ago, my daughter's husband kicked me out of my own home. He brought his parents to live there instead. The very next day, they planned a party in my living room, under my roof, as if my history and my memories had been packed away with me. Tonight, I stand in that same room again. But I am not alone. I walk through the doorway with Julia Bennett at my side. She is a woman in her early 60s, elegant in a navy dress, her eyes scanning the room with a calm confidence that unsettles those who notice her. In her hand, a neat leather folder. Inside it, the signed transfer papers for the house. Mark, my son-in-law, stops mid-pour, the red wine trembling at the lip of the bottle. His face drains of color the moment he sees me. Lila, my daughter, freezes in the doorway from the kitchen, a linen towel still clutched in her hand. Around them, guests in their best clothes hold their glasses halfway to their lips, sensing the sudden weight in the air. I take a few steady steps forward. My heels click softly against the hardwood floor Daniel laid himself 25 years ago. I stop beside the dining table, set for celebration. China plates, candles, floral centerpieces that smell nothing like the roses from my garden. From the crook of my arm, I place my silver teapot in the very center of the table. The candlelight catches on its surface, throwing back a flash so sharp it makes Mark flinch. "This," I say, my voice even, carrying across the room, "is Julia Bennett, the new owner of this house." Mark's mouth opens, but no sound comes. The guests glance between him and Julia, confusion creeping into their expressions. Julia steps forward, her voice warm yet firm. "The sale was finalized this morning. Ms. Clark retained full ownership of the property. She's chosen to sell it to me." Lila's eyes dart to mine, wide with disbelief, as if she's only just realized that beneath my quiet compliance, I've been holding every card that matters. "You have 30 days to move out," I add. I do not raise my voice. I do not need to. The stillness around us makes every syllable land like a stone dropped into water. In the corner, Mark's parents, who moved in less than a week ago, stand stiff and pale. I recognize the subtle tightening of their jaws, the discomfort of realizing they have been invited into someone else's home under false pretenses. Mark finally finds his voice. "You can't just..." "I can," I say simply, and I let the silence finish the sentence for me. That silence is heavier than shouting. It draws every gaze in the room, narrows the space between us until he looks away first. I turn my eyes to the silver pot on the table. It's the same one Daniel polished every Sunday morning, the one I've poured tea from on birthdays, anniversaries, and countless quiet afternoons. It has seen more truth than most people in this room. I pick it up again and cradle it in my arms. "I'll take this," I tell no one in particular. "It belongs where it will be used, not displayed like a trophy." Julia gives me the faintest nod. We do not linger. We do not explain. We walk back through the same doorway we entered, our steps unhurried, leaving behind a roomful of frozen faces and untouched wine. As the cool night air hits my skin, I breathe in, steady and deep. My heart is not racing. It is steady, like the tide against the shore. 1 week ago, they believed they could erase me from my own life. Tonight, I reminded them that erasing me is impossible. And as Julia's car door closes beside me, I know this is not the end of the story. This is only where I begin telling you how it happened. Because a week ago, on an ordinary morning, everything I thought was secure was taken from me. The morning it happened was cool and still, the kind of morning that used to mean safety to me. I was in the kitchen, the silver teapot warming on the stove, the faint scent of Earl Grey drifting through the air. Daniel always said tea smelled like home. Even now, 8 years after he passed, I kept that ritual. The garden was quiet beyond the window. The roses were just beginning to open. I was setting out my cup when I heard the tires on the gravel drive. Not the postman, not Evelyn from church. The sound was too heavy, too abrupt. Mark's SUV rolled to a stop outside, its dark paint catching the pale morning light. He stepped out first, tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt tucked in as if for business. Lila followed a moment later, holding her purse like a shield. Neither of them was smiling. I opened the door before they knocked. "You're here early," I said. My voice was calm, the kind you use with strangers at the grocery store. Mark didn't waste time. "We need to talk," he said, glancing past me into the house. Lila avoided my eyes. I moved aside, and they stepped in. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, not bothering to take off his shoes. "My parents have sold their house," he began. "They'll be moving in here for a while." The words settled in the air like dust after a collapse. "Here," I repeated, though I understood perfectly. "Yes, it just makes sense," Mark continued. "The upstairs has plenty of space. They need somewhere stable while they find a new place." I waited for Lila to say something, to soften it, to remind me this was still my home. She didn't. She looked at her hands instead. Mark's voice was measured as though he were explaining a business arrangement. "It will be easier for everyone if you can. Find somewhere else for a while, a couple of months at most." Somewhere else. Not here. Not in the house Daniel and I saved for, renovated with our own hands, filled with memories of raising our only child. I didn't ask why his parents couldn't rent an apartment. I didn't ask why my daughter hadn't spoken to me first. In that moment, the questions would have been stones thrown into a deep well, never heard again. Instead, I nodded once. "I'll pack a few things." Mark's shoulders eased, as if relief were the only courtesy he owed me. "Thank you, Naomi. This will be for the best." The best? For whom, I wondered, but kept it to myself. I went upstairs to the bedroom Daniel and I had shared. The morning light pooled on the quilt, the one my mother sewed the year we married. I pulled it from the bed and folded it carefully. From the top drawer of the dresser, I took the silk scarf Daniel brought me from Boston, still smelling faintly of cedar from the wardrobe. On the nightstand sat our wedding album, its leather cover worn soft. I slid it into my bag without opening it. Some things didn't need to be relived right now. In the corner of the room, on the low table by the window, sat the silver teapot. I lifted it gently, feeling the familiar weight. My reflection stared back at me in its curve. A woman older than she imagined herself, but steadier than she had ever been. Downstairs, Lila was in the kitchen, her back to me. She was pretending to study the spice rack. "Mom," she began, but her voice faltered. "It's fine," I said, before she could arrange the words into something less harsh. "You have your life. I have mine." She turned then, her eyes searching my face for something. Anger, maybe. But I had none to give her. Not yet. Only space. Mark was by the door, scrolling through his phone. "Do you need help moving things to your car?" he asked. "No," I said. "I know what to take." It took me less than 10 minutes to gather the rest. A small box of china cups from my mother, my wool cardigan for cool evenings, a framed photograph of the garden in full bloom. I left the rest behind. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of salt from the sea, a wind pushing clouds toward the horizon. I placed the bag and the box into the trunk of my old sedan, then set the teapot on the passenger seat beside me. As I closed the door, I looked up at the house. The lace curtains in the front windows moved slightly in the breeze, like a hand waving me off. I did not wave back. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that looked older than me. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed, each step carrying me farther from the life I had known. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and something metallic. The walls were bare. The carpet was thin and rough under my shoes. There was a single window in the living room, the kind that stuck when you tried to open it. I set my bag on the floor, the sound echoing in the hollow space. It was quiet, too quiet. At home, even when no one spoke, there was the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock Daniel bought at a flea market, the low rustle of leaves from the garden. Here, the silence was empty, not comforting. I walked to the window and pulled the cord to raise the blinds. The view was nothing like the one I had left behind. Instead of roses and the curve of our stone path, there was an alley lined with dented trash cans, a fire escape zigzagging down the opposite wall. A cat jumped onto a lid, its tail flicking like it owned the place. I turned away. The small kitchen was barely more than a counter and a sink. I ran the tap. The water came out in a cloudy rush before clearing. On the counter, I set down the silver teapot. It looked out of place here, its polished surface catching the weak afternoon light. For a moment, I just stared at it. My hand reached out on its own, brushing the handle, and suddenly I was back in the garden, years ago. Daniel was kneeling beside the rose bushes, wearing that sun-faded baseball cap with the frayed brim. "You have to talk to them," he'd said, sprinkling water over the soil. "Roses know when you're paying attention." I had laughed then, leaning on the fence. "And what do you say to a rose?" "That depends," he'd answered, standing up with that slow, easy grace. "Sometimes I tell them they're looking strong. Sometimes I just tell them thank you." The memory was so clear I could almost smell the earth and hear the soft hiss of the watering can. I shook it off and unpacked the rest of my things. The quilt went on the bed, a bed that felt too firm, too strange. The scarf stayed in the top drawer. The wedding album I left in my bag. I wasn't ready for its weight yet. By evening, the light outside shifted to that dim blue that comes just before night. I boiled water, poured it into the teapot, and sat at the tiny kitchen table with my cup. The tea didn't taste the same. Maybe it was the water. Maybe it was the missing sound of Daniel's chair scraping across the floor. The phone on the counter buzzed. Evelyn's name lit the screen. "Naomi," she said when I answered, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who has known all your seasons. "I heard from Carol. Is it true? You've left the house?" "Yes," I said. "I've relocated for a while." There was a pause. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" I looked at the teapot. the steam curling upward like a question I didn't know how to answer. Mark and Lila thought it best if I gave them space. For his parents, Evelyn didn't rush to fill the silence. That's what I loved about her. She let it stretch until it felt like a choice, not an absence. "Well," she said finally, "then maybe it's time you gave yourself space, too." The words settled in me differently than Mark's had. His were a door closing. Hers were a window opening. Just a crack. We talked for a while longer. About her daughter's new job. About the cold snap coming next week. Ordinary things. But when I hung up, the apartment didn't feel quite as hollow. I rinsed my cup, set it upside down to dry, and stood for a moment in the kitchen. The silver teapot gleamed softly in the low light. It was still here. So was I. I told myself that tomorrow I would buy a plant. Something green to keep me company. Maybe not roses. They needed more sun than this place could offer. But something alive. Something I could talk to. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the counter. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The light through the blinds was thin and gray. I rubbed my eyes, walked barefoot to the kitchen, and answered without looking at the screen. "Naomi, it's me." Evelyn's voice came through, brisk but warm, the way someone sounds when they've already had their coffee. "Are you awake?" "I am now," I said, pulling the cardigan tighter around me. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause, the kind that tells you the answer is no. "I drove past your old street last night," she began. "Naomi, your house was lit up like the 4th of July. Cars lined up along the curb, music pouring out the windows. And it wasn't quiet, neighborly music. It was..." She hesitated. "A full-blown party." I felt something inside me shift, like a plate sliding on a shelf. "A party," I repeated, as if the word might mean something different in her mouth. "Yes." People I didn't recognize going in and out. And Mark's car was out front. So was Lila's. I walked to the small kitchen table and sat down. My hands were cold, even wrapped around the warm mug I'd poured earlier. "They didn't mention anything to me," I said quietly. Evelyn exhaled sharply. "Of course they didn't. And that's not all. You remember the Rensons? From 2 streets over?" I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Well, Susan's sister works at the county records office. She mentioned, off the record, that there's been some movement on your property file. An inquiry. Someone's been looking into the title and the deed." The words landed heavier than I expected. "The deed?" "Yes. I'm not saying anything's happened yet, but Naomi, why would they be checking those papers unless they were planning something?" I thought of the silver teapot sitting on the counter, a lone survivor from my old kitchen. I pictured strangers walking through my home, the way you do at an open house, touching walls, peering into cupboards, while my things were still there. The quilt, the rose clippers Daniel left hanging in the shed. "Maybe it's nothing," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Evelyn echoed, but her tone told me she didn't believe it either. "You know, the house is in your name alone, right? Daniel made sure of that. Do you have the papers with you?" I hesitated. "They're in the lockbox at the bank. I haven't looked at them in years." "Well," she said, "maybe it's time you did." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that was heavy but not uncomfortable. Then she added, "Naomi, I don't like how this feels. They kick you out for his parents, and the next day there's a party. And now, paperwork? If I were you, I'd be careful. Very careful. I thanked her and hung up, but the conversation stayed with me like a stone in my pocket. I tried to go about my day, washing the single plate I'd used for breakfast, folding my sweater over the back of the chair, but my mind kept circling back to the same questions. What kind of party? Who was there? And why now? By afternoon, I found myself walking toward the bank. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. The clerk recognized me and led me to the small private room where the lockbox was kept. I set it on the table, the metal cool against my palms. The key turned with a click, and the lid lifted easily. Inside, neatly stacked, were the documents Daniel and I had kept over the years. Insurance papers, his Army discharge certificate, the deed to the house. I pulled it out, the thick paper smooth under my fingers. My name was there, clear and unmistakable. Naomi Bennett, sole owner. But in the lower right corner, I noticed something I hadn't remembered before. A small note in Daniel's handwriting. He'd penciled in, "Never let this go without a choice. Yours." I traced the letters with my finger, a warmth rising in my chest despite the cold knot in my stomach. Daniel had always thought ahead. When I left the bank, the street outside looked different. Sharper, somehow. If Mark and Lila were planning something, they were going to learn that I still had choices. That night, I called Evelyn back. "I have the deed," I told her, "and I think I know what to do." The next morning, I made an appointment with Miles Harrington. I'd known of him for years. He'd handled probate for a friend's estate, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words or time. Evelyn said he was discreet, which mattered more than I wanted to admit. His office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind with narrow windows and the faint scent of furniture polish lingering in the air. I arrived early, clutching the manila envelope that held my deed, the note Daniel had left, and a few other papers that might be relevant. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, led me into a small conference room. A tall man in a dark suit entered moments later, extending a hand. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm Miles. Evelyn mentioned you might stop by." I shook his hand and sat down across from him, laying the envelope on the table. "I need to know exactly where I stand," I began. He listened without interrupting as I told him about Mark and Lila, the eviction for his parents, the party, and the hint about someone looking into the property records. When I finished, he reached for the envelope. "Let's have a look." He read the deed carefully, flipping through each page with a methodical patience. At one point, he nodded to himself. "Yes, here it is. Sole ownership in your name. No joint tenants, no liens recorded. This house is yours outright." "And if I wanted to sell it?" I asked, my voice even. "You have every legal right to do so without anyone else's consent. You could list it tomorrow if you wished." Something in me loosened at those words. It wasn't joy exactly, but the relief of knowing the ground beneath me was still solid. Miles leaned back slightly. "If someone's been inquiring about the property file, it might mean they're looking for leverage, convincing you to sign something, maybe a transfer. But they can't take it without your signature, Naomi, and you're under no obligation to give it." I thought about Lila's carefully polite smile, the way she never quite met my eyes when she wanted something. I thought about Mark, my own son, standing silent beside her while I packed my things. "I don't want to wait for them to come to me," I said finally. Miles studied me for a moment. "Then don't. Do you have a plan?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But I want to make sure whatever I do is airtight. No loopholes they can wriggle through." He nodded slowly. "If you were to sell, you'd need a buyer ready to move quickly. Cash preferred. And we'd file the transfer before they had time to react. That would end any discussion about ownership." The idea settled in my mind like a seed finding soil. Not revenge exactly, just reclaiming what Daniel had left for me. Miles tapped the deed with one finger. "Naomi, I can draw up preliminary documents so that when you find a buyer, we can move within 24 hours. No delays." "I'd appreciate that," I said, feeling the first spark of control in days. He smiled faintly. "One more thing. Keep this quiet. The less they know, the better." When I left his office, the autumn air felt sharper, almost invigorating. I walked past the florist Daniel and I used to visit, the one where he bought me a small rose bush for our anniversary. In the window, a cluster of deep red blooms caught my eye. They reminded me that beauty could still exist in hostile spaces. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to plead with Mark. I wasn't going to demand answers from Lila. I would let them throw their party, fill my home with strangers and laughter that didn't belong there, because I had something better in mind. That night, I took out my old leather address book. Miles had said I'd need a buyer ready to move fast. I flipped through the worn pages until I found the name I was looking for: Julia Harrington, Evelyn's cousin, a woman who, last I'd heard, had been looking for a historic home in our part of town. I traced her number with my fingertip before picking up the phone. "Julia, it's Naomi Bennett. I have something you might be interested in." Her voice warmed instantly. "Naomi, it's been years. What is it?" "It's about my house," I said, "and I think the timing might be perfect for both of us." As we spoke, I realized I was no longer thinking about what I had lost 2 days ago. I was thinking about what I still had, and how I was going to decide its future on my terms. That night, I couldn't sleep. The radiator hissed in the corner of the small apartment, but the room still felt colder than it should have. I sat by the window, cradling a cup of chamomile tea, and let my mind drift back to a time when life was different. Daniel and I had bought the land 32 years ago, a patch of overgrown grass with an old oak tree leaning like it had secrets to keep. It wasn't much to look at, but Daniel saw more than I could at first. He had a way of pointing to an empty space and describing it so vividly that I could almost see the walls, the windows, the life we would have there. We spent that first summer clearing brush and marking where the foundation would go. Daniel handled the heavy work, but he insisted I choose the windows, the light fixtures, even the height of the kitchen counters. "It has to feel like you," he'd say, brushing sawdust from his hair. The day the frame went up, we stood in the middle of it, just beams and open sky, and Daniel wrapped his arms around me. "One day," he whispered, "we'll fill this place with family." In my mind, I can still hear the echo of his boots on the unfinished floor, the smell of fresh pine, the way the sunlight cut through the open rafters. I blinked, and the memory shifted. The same living room, our living room, now had different voices. Lila's laughter rang out, sharp and too loud, the sound of glasses clinking, Music turned up just enough to make conversation strain. The oak table Daniel had built with his own hands was covered with party decorations. My mother's china sat on the sideboard, not in the careful arrangement I'd kept for decades, but scattered among plastic cups and napkins. I thought about the garden Daniel had loved. We'd planted roses along the fence, deep crimson, pale blush, and a single yellow bush just because I liked the color. Every spring, he'd prune them with a patience that made me smile. Now, through a neighbor's phone photo Evelyn had shown me, I saw lawn chairs set right where the roses had been, their blooms trampled into the soil. The images tangled in my mind. Then and now, until it was almost unbearable to separate them. One moment I was back in the kitchen with Daniel, rolling out dough for cinnamon rolls while he pretended not to steal bites. The next, I was watching strangers dance in that same kitchen, stepping where he once stood. I set the teacup down, my hands tightening around the arm of the chair. People think grief is sharp, but sometimes it's the dull weight that crushes you. Losing Daniel had been a clean wound. What Mark and Lila were doing now, that felt like salt ground, in slowly, deliberately. I stood and walked to the small dresser in the corner. From the top drawer, I pulled out the silver tea set Daniel had given me on our 20th anniversary. I'd taken it with me when I left the house, one of the few things I couldn't bear to leave behind. The teapot was still warm in my memory from the last time he'd poured for me, smiling over the rim of his cup. I polished the surface with the edge of a cotton cloth, watching my reflection blur and sharpen again. This was more than silver and porcelain. This was the anchor to a life we'd built together, a life I wasn't going to let be rewritten by someone else's greed or carelessness. As the night wore on, the line between memory and resolve hardened. I could almost hear Daniel's voice again, low and certain. "Stand your ground, Naomi. You know what's right." By the time the first light of morning crept through the window, I knew I couldn't just sit here remembering. I had to act, not out of spite, but out of respect. For him, for us, for the years we'd poured into that home. I reached for my phone and scrolled to Julia's number. If she loved the house even half as much as I did, I knew she'd see what I saw, the history in its walls, the promise in its rooms. And maybe, just maybe, she'd be the one to help me keep that promise alive, even if it meant letting go. Miles called me the next morning. His voice, always even, carried a note of quiet assurance. "Naomi, I might have someone for you. Her name's Julia Harper. She's not looking for just any house. She's looking for a home." Something in the way he said it made me sit a little straighter. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the courthouse. Julia arrived on time, sliding into the seat across from me with a warm smile that reached her eyes. She was in her late 40s, hair pulled back loosely, a worn leather notebook tucked under her arm. "Miles told me about the house," she began, her tone respectful, as if she already sensed it wasn't just property to me. "He said you and your husband built it yourselves?" I nodded, my fingers curling around my teacup. "Every inch of it," I said, "from the roses in the garden to the beams in the attic." Her eyes lit up. The roses. Those were what caught my attention first. I drove by once, years ago. Even in early spring, you could tell they were cared for with love. I've always thought a garden says more about a home than the walls do. I couldn't help but smile at that. My husband thought the same. He said a garden was proof you believed in the future. Julia leaned forward slightly. "I'm not in a rush to gut or change anything. I'm looking for a place with a story, something I can be part of, not erase. I've made that mistake before. I studied her face. There was no slick salesmanship, no hurried eagerness to close a deal, just a quiet sincerity, the kind that felt rare these days. She opened her notebook, flipping to a page where a rough sketch of the house sat beside notes in tidy handwriting. I'd like to keep the garden as it is. Maybe add a bench near the yellow rose bush, if you don't mind. I pictured it immediately. Someone else tending those roses, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Would you like to see the house? I asked, surprising myself with how easily the words came. Her smile widened. I'd be honored. We arranged to meet later that afternoon, when I knew Mark and Lila would be out. My heart thudded a little faster as we pulled into the driveway. The front lawn looked the same as it always had from the street, but I knew the inside carried the marks of their presence, changes I didn't want Julia to see just yet. Still, as we walked through the rooms, Julia's gaze softened, not at the furniture or the decor, but at the bones of the house. She ran her fingers along the banister Daniel had sanded smooth, paused in the kitchen where the morning light fell just right, and stepped out into the garden as if she'd been waiting for that moment. She crouched beside the yellow rosebush, touching one of the blooms gently. "This one's my favorite," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It feels hopeful." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It was exactly the word Daniel had used years ago when he planted it for me. Julia stood, brushing her hands off. "I can see the life that's been here. I don't want to take that away. If I bought this house, Naomi, I'd take care of it like it was always yours." The air between us felt different then, less like a transaction and more like an agreement between two people who understood the weight of memory. I locked the back gate behind us, feeling the solid click of the latch. "Miles will handle the paperwork," I said quietly. "But I think you might be the right one." Her eyes softened. "Thank you for trusting me." As I watched her drive away, the garden swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, I realized that for the first time in weeks, the tightness in my chest had loosened. This wasn't just about reclaiming my space. It was about ensuring that Daniel's work and my memories would survive in the right hands. And maybe, just maybe, it was about me letting go on my own terms. 2 days later, we met again in Miles's quiet office. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon light, and the faint scent of old paper and leather-bound books wrapped around us. Miles sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, watching us both with the kind of patience that only comes from decades in law. Julia laid her notebook on the table, open to a clean page. "I've been thinking about how to make this easy for you," she said. "And discreet." I glanced at Miles. "Discreet is the key word here." He nodded. "Legally, Naomi, the house is still in your name. You have full authority to sell. But if you don't want to trigger trouble before you're ready, we can structure the agreement in a way that's quiet." Julia pulled a pen from her bag. "Here's my thought. I'll pay a deposit up front, large enough to secure the sale, but small enough not to require immediate public filing. That buys you time to remove your personal items, your husband's things, and anything else you want to keep." The idea settled over me like a warm blanket. "And they won't see any transfer paperwork until we're ready to record it," Miles finished. "Which could be after, say, 30 days. Julia's gaze was steady. I want you to have the time to walk through your home on your terms, not under their watch. I felt a tightness in my throat. For weeks, every action I took in that house had been measured, watched, subtly judged. The thought of moving freely again, even for a short time, felt like air after drowning. Miles slid a draft agreement across the desk. Clause 1. Naomi retains possession until she has removed all personal property she wishes to keep. Clause 2. Julia pays an immediate deposit of... He paused, glancing at her. She named a number without hesitation. It was generous, more than enough to cover any expenses I might have in the interim. I hesitated. That's too much for a deposit. Julia shook her head. It's the right amount for peace of mind. We both signed. Miles added his notary seal with a crisp press, then leaned back. Once you have what you need, Naomi, let me know. We'll set the closing date. In the meantime, no one outside this room needs to know. The following afternoon, I drove to the house when I knew Mark and Lila were out. My hands didn't shake as I unlocked the door. The living room smelled faintly of the citrus cleaner Lila favored. Too sharp, too sterile. I went straight to the cabinet in the corner, unlocking it to reveal the silver tea set Daniel had given me on our 10th anniversary. The engraved tray still bore the tiny scratch from when he dropped his cufflink on it. One by one, I wrapped the pieces in soft cloth and placed them in the box Julia had given me. In the bedroom, I took the framed photograph of Daniel standing in front of the rose garden, sunlight catching the edges of his hair. I slipped it into my bag, along with the journal he'd kept during the first year we built the house. Every item I touched was deliberate, not for value, but for meaning. By the time I locked the door behind me, the sun was low and the garden was bathed in gold. I paused, my hand resting on the gate. Soon, this place would no longer be mine, but it would be safe. That night, Julia called. "Deposit's cleared," she said. "You can take as long as you need." I exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Julia. You don't know how much this means." Her voice softened. "I think I do." We didn't talk about Mark or Lila. We didn't need to. The agreement was more than legal. It was a pact between two women who understood the value of holding your ground without raising your voice. As I hung up, I realized something. For the first time since they'd told me to leave, I wasn't lying awake wondering how to survive the next day. I already had a plan. And this time, they wouldn't see it coming. The call came from Evelyn 2 mornings later. "They've sent out invitations," she whispered, as if the walls of her own kitchen might have ears. "Mark and Lila are throwing a welcome party for his parents, at your house." I stirred my tea slowly, letting the words settle. "When?" "This Saturday evening. Catered. Music. They're expecting 40 people." I pictured the silver tea set now safely in my apartment closet, the framed photo of Daniel leaning against the lamp. My house, our house, turned into a stage for them to show off. After I hung up, I dialed Miles. "They're planning the party," I said without preamble. "I think that's the day." He didn't need me to explain further. The day to introduce Julia as the buyer. "Yes, but I don't want a scene." "You won't make one," he replied calmly. "You'll just arrive, with the rightful owner beside you, and let the truth speak for itself." We met that afternoon in his office. Julia was already there, her expression a mixture of anticipation and restraint. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair tied back, but there was something about the way she carried herself, steady, unapologetic, that made me feel taller just standing next to her. Miles spread the paperwork on the table. "Here's how it will go. Naomi, You arrive with Julia right as the party is underway. Julia will be there as a prospective buyer, which is technically still true until closing is filed. You'll be holding the final paperwork, sealed in this envelope. He tapped the envelope with 2 fingers. If they confront you, you remain calm. No raised voices. Julia will simply say she's here to look at the property before finalizing the purchase. The presence of guests will keep things civil, at least on the surface. I imagined Mark's face, the flicker of confusion before realization set in. And after the party? After the party, Miles said, we send the recorded deed to their mailbox. No confrontation, just fact. Julia glanced at me. I'll also bring my real estate agent friend. She can wander around, taking photos, asking questions. It will make it clear this isn't a casual visit. I couldn't help but smile. You've done this before. Not exactly this, she admitted. But I've learned that sometimes the quietest entrance makes the loudest statement. We set the timing down to the minute, arriving 20 minutes after the official start, when the room would be full enough to notice, but not yet loud enough to drown out our presence. Miles insisted on one more detail. Naomi, bring something of yours, something that has always belonged in that house. Place it somewhere visible before you leave. It will serve as a signature. I knew instantly what it would be. The silver teapot from Daniel's set. I would place it on the dining table, polished until it caught every light in the room. The rest of the week passed in slow preparation. I pressed my dress. A deep emerald green Daniel once said made my eyes look alive. I polished the teapot until my reflection stared back. I even bought a new pair of low heels, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to walk in without the faintest trace of hesitation. On Friday evening, Julia called. Are you ready? As I'll ever be. We'll meet at Miles's at 6:30, she said. He'll drive us together. Neutral ground before we walk in. That night, I didn't lie awake counting the cracks in the ceiling. I closed my eyes and pictured the moment I'd step through my own front door again. Not as an intruder, not as someone to be shuffled aside, but as the woman who still held the key. I could almost see Mark's face, the way the color would drain when he realized the party wasn't for him anymore. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't nervous. I was steady. The kind of steady that comes when you know the truth is finally about to walk into the room. By the time Miles parked the car 2 houses down, the street was already lined with vehicles. Warm light spilled from the windows of my house, painting the driveway in gold. From outside, I could hear the faint hum of conversation, punctuated by bursts of polite laughter. I sat still for a moment, my hand resting on the polished silver teapot in my lap. Julia sat beside me, calm as ever, her navy coat buttoned neatly, a folder tucked under her arm. Miles turned slightly in the driver's seat. Remember, he said quietly, you are not here to fight. You are here to arrive. I nodded. I've been ready for this since the moment they told me to leave. We stepped out into the cool evening air. The faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney mingled with something richer. Garlic, butter, roasted meat. The kind of smells Daniel used to coax from our kitchen on special occasions. My stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from the familiarity. We walked up the driveway together, Julia on my right, Miles on my left. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of the living room. Mark shaking hands with someone, Lila laughing just a bit too brightly, and beyond them, strangers. Men in crisp suits, women in jewel-toned dresses, mingling in spaces where I once placed vases of fresh roses. Miles rang the doorbell, though the door was slightly ajar. The chime echoed through the house, and after a moment, Lila appeared. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Naomi," she said. Her tone caught somewhere between surprise and irritation. Her eyes flicked to Julia, then to Miles. "I didn't know you were invited." "I wasn't," I replied evenly. "But Julia here had an appointment to see the property, and I thought I'd join her." Julia offered her hand, her smile polite, almost warm. "Lovely home," she said. Lila didn't take the hand. "We're in the middle of a family event." "Then it's the perfect time," Julia said gently. "I like to see a house when it's alive." Before Lila could respond, Mark appeared behind her. His expression shifted from casual host to stone in an instant. "What is this?" he demanded. Miles spoke before I could. "Just a scheduled viewing, Mark. Nothing disruptive. Julia's considering making this her home." A faint ripple passed through the air behind them as a few guests turned to glance our way. Lila stepped aside reluctantly, and we entered. The smell of food enveloped me. Roast lamb, rosemary, fresh bread. The clink of glasses and low music from the stereo blended into a haze. But my eyes kept catching on details. The rug Daniel and I chose from a market in Santa Fe, now pressed under unfamiliar shoes. The framed photographs of Mark's in-laws on the mantel where our family pictures used to stand. Julia moved through the space with practiced ease, glancing at ceilings, pausing to admire the crown molding. Miles kept pace, clipboard in hand, asking the sort of questions that made guests whisper, "How old is the roof? Are the appliances part of the sale?" I carried the teapot into the dining room, where a long table was laid out with china, my china, and platters of food. I set the teapot right in the center, letting the silver catch the light from the chandelier. No one said a word, but I saw a woman across the table lean in to her companion and murmur something. Mark followed us into the room. "This is inappropriate," he said, his voice low but tight. Julia turned to him, her tone still polite. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but the current owner assured me this evening would be fine for a walkthrough." "The current owner?" His eyes flicked to me. I met his gaze. "Yes, the current owner." The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was deep. It settled over the room like a shadow, and though the music still played, the air had shifted. Mark's face, drained of color, as if someone had just pulled the floor from under him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Lila's gaze darted between the three of us, me, Julia, Miles, like she was trying to solve a puzzle whose answer she already feared. "What do you mean, current owner?" Mark finally asked, his voice brittle. I reached into my bag and drew out the folder Miles had prepared. My fingers didn't shake. They were steady in a way I hadn't felt in months. I slid the documents across the polished wood of the dining table. "This house," I said, my voice carrying clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, "is no longer yours to use as you please. The sale closed this morning. Julia here is the new owner." The words seemed to hang in the air. Conversations in the adjoining rooms slowed, then stilled. A man near the sideboard shifted uncomfortably, setting down his glass with a soft clink. Lila let out a short, sharp laugh. Too loud. Too quick. "You can't just sell it. You were living here as a guest, Naomi. This house belongs to Mark." Julia's tone was gentle but firm. Actually, the deed was solely in Naomi's name. I confirmed it with the county records before making my offer. Mark's jaw tightened. Why would you? He stopped himself, his eyes narrowing. This is about revenge, isn't it? I met his stare without flinching. No, Mark. This is about boundaries. You made it clear there was no place for me here. I took you at your word. Behind him, Lila's mother had drifted closer, curiosity plain on her face. Others followed. The scent of rosemary and roasted lamb now mingled with something sharper, tension. Miles stepped forward, calm as ever. You have 30 days to vacate, per the agreement. Naomi will retrieve her personal items during that time. If you'd like, we can arrange a schedule that works for you. Mark's voice rose, losing its earlier restraint. You think you can humiliate us in front of our friends? In our own home? I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat before answering. This stopped being my home the moment you told me to leave so your parents could have it. You turned it into a place where I was unwelcome. I just made it official. Julia rested a hand on the back of a dining chair, unbothered by the stares. I'll be making some changes once I move in, she said conversationally. But I do plan to keep the rose garden. Naomi told me her late husband planted it. It's the soul of the property. That was the moment Lila's composure cracked. You're going to let her what? Wander in here with a stranger and strip everything away? She demanded, her voice pitched high enough to draw more eyes. Mark didn't answer. His face was still pale, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man doing mental math and realizing he'd miscalculated badly. I picked up the silver teapot from the table and held it lightly, in both hands. This, I said quietly, was the last gift Daniel gave me before he passed. I'm taking it with me tonight. The rest, I'll collect later. The room seemed to exhale at once, some in disbelief, some in discomfort, a few in something that almost felt like admiration. Lila's father cleared his throat. Perhaps we should let them finish their evening, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. I turned toward the door, Julia and Miles falling into step beside me. As we passed through the hallway, my gaze caught the empty spot on the wall where our wedding photo used to hang. In its place was a generic landscape print, pretty but soulless. When we stepped outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. I heard the muffled thud of the door closing behind us, sealing whatever storm was brewing inside. In the quiet, Julia glanced at me. You handled that with grace. I took a slow breath. I didn't come to fight. I came to reclaim what was mine. Miles unlocked the car, but before getting in, I turned back for one last look at the house. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful, bathed in golden light. But I knew better. It's not about the walls or the furniture, I murmured. It's about who decides you belong. And tonight, I'd decided that for myself. Evelyn was waiting across the street, leaning casually against her car, the way she always did when she didn't want to be noticed right away. Her scarf caught the wind, a flash of deep red against the pale night. I crossed to her slowly, my shoes clicking on the pavement. She didn't speak until I was close enough for her to study my face. Well? She asked, her voice low, as if we were still inside that house. It's done, I said. My hands were empty now. The silver teapot was safely in Julia's trunk, but I felt lighter, as if I'd set down more than just metal and porcelain. Evelyn opened the passenger door for me. I slid in, the familiar scent of her lavender sachets washing over me. The heater hummed gently, a a soft warmth against my legs. As she drove, the lights of the neighborhood drifted past. Windows lit for the party, silhouettes moving inside. A few streets away, the music faded to nothing but memory. She glanced at me. "You don't look triumphant." "I'm not," I admitted. This wasn't about winning. It was about ending something. She didn't reply right away, and I was grateful. Silence, in that moment, felt like the only language I could speak. I thought about the way Mark had looked, pale, cornered, unsure for once. But there was no satisfaction in that image. I'd lived too many years measuring my worth against someone else's discomfort. Tonight wasn't about punishing them. It was about not letting them decide the shape of my days anymore. Evelyn's turn signal clicked softly as we waited at a light. "So what now?" she asked. I leaned my head back against the seat. Now I stop waiting for people to make room for me. I start building something where I don't have to ask. Her smile was small but real. "You've always had that in you. Just took the right push." We passed a corner where the florist used to be, the one Daniel and I visited every spring. In the window now was a neon sign for a cell phone repair shop. I felt the familiar ache of change, the way it erases without asking permission. "I used to think that house was the last piece of us I had left," I said quietly. Turns out it wasn't the walls I was holding on to. It was the garden, and the garden's going with Julia. She'll keep it alive. "And you'll plant new ones," Evelyn said. The car's tires whispered over the asphalt. My chest felt calmer, my breath deeper. I realized then that the fear I'd carried for months, the fear of losing what was mine, had been replaced by something steadier. Not joy, exactly, but space. Space to think. Space to dream again. When we reached my apartment, Evelyn didn't rush to say goodbye. She turned off the engine and sat with me in the quiet hum of the cooling car. "You could have moved out quietly," she said, finally. "You could have just taken your things and left, but you went back." I looked at her, my hand on the door handle, because I needed to see their faces when they realized I wasn't the woman they thought I was. Her eyes softened. "And who are you now?" I thought about it for a moment, feeling the weight of the question. Someone who knows the difference between leaving because you're unwanted and leaving because you choose to. I stepped out into the night air, the cold nipping at my cheeks. Evelyn waited until I was at the door before pulling away, her taillights glowing red before they disappeared around the corner. Inside, the apartment was just as I'd left it. Quiet, a little sparse, but mine. On the kitchen counter sat the small potted rose Evelyn had given me last month, its petals still clinging to life despite the winter chill. I set the silver teapot beside it. For a moment, the two objects, one from my past, one from my present, seemed to hold a conversation in the silence. I didn't feel victorious. I felt returned. To myself. To the version of me that didn't measure her worth in square footage or family approval. And as I boiled water for tea, I realized I hadn't just left a party tonight. I'd left the need for their acceptance at the door of that house. The ocean was the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes. A thin ribbon of pale light shimmered across the water, the waves rolling in steady and sure, as if they'd been waiting for me all along. The apartment was smaller than the house, but the air here tasted different, salted, alive. From my balcony, I could see a few early walkers on the sand, their dogs racing ahead, the gulls calling out overhead. I'd moved in 2 days ago, the ink still drying on Julia's down payment. Most of my things fit into a handful of boxes. I didn't bring the heavy furniture or the ornate pieces Mark and Lila used to admire, just the essentials and the items that felt like me. The silver teapot sat on the kitchen shelf, next to a row of mismatched mugs. Below it, on the counter, the small rose plant tilted toward the morning sun. I made tea, letting the steam curl around my face. The floor beneath my feet was cool, the kind that would warm as the day moved forward. Money wasn't the problem now. Julia's advance gave me more than enough to pay for this place, cover my bills, and have a cushion for whatever came next. I could live here quietly for years if I wanted to, or I could travel, or take up that painting class I'd once promised myself. And yet, as I stood there with my tea, I felt an old question circling. Should I tell Lila? Not about the sale, Mark had surely told her by now, but about Julia's intentions. About the 30 days they had before the new deed took effect. It wasn't my responsibility anymore, legally or otherwise, but part of me wondered if a warning would be kind. Kindness, though. What had it cost me before? I carried my cup to the balcony, letting the cool wind press against my cheeks. From here, the house was far enough away that it felt like a different chapter, one I'd closed with a firm spine. But Lila's face still hovered in my mind, flushed, tense, caught between pride and panic. I thought about the years I'd extended kindness like a rope, only to find it used to pull me under. And about Daniel, how he believed that patience and generosity could heal anyone, given enough time. He'd been right, sometimes, but not always. The water below caught the sunlight now, flashing gold at the crests. I took a sip of tea and felt the warmth sink into me. Evelyn's words from the drive home replayed in my mind. You left because you chose to. Yes, that was the difference. This place, this life, was my choice. And choices came with boundaries. I set the mug down and went inside, picking up my phone from the counter. My thumb hovered over Lila's number, the familiar digits blurring slightly in my vision. I imagined the call, her voice sharp at first, then wary. I imagined her asking why I hadn't told her sooner, why I hadn't given her a chance to fix things. I imagined myself explaining that this wasn't about punishment, that I simply didn't want to be in a home where I had to earn my welcome. I set the phone back down. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is let them face the truth without cushioning the blow. Sometimes warning them robs them of the lesson they need to learn. The gulls cried louder now, a sound both mournful and free. I opened the balcony door wider, letting the sea breeze fill the room. There was still unpacking to do, pictures to hang, a life to arrange. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was on borrowed time. The garden at the old house would go on without me. Julia would tend it. The roses would bloom in their season. And here, maybe I'd plant herbs on the balcony, a few pots of lavender to scent the evenings. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and left it to dry. The phone stayed on the counter, screen dark, number unsent. From the balcony, the horizon stretched wide and open, the kind that didn't care where you'd been, only where you wanted to go next. The days began to find their own rhythm. No more waking to the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. No more waiting to see who would knock on my bedroom door, or whether I'd be welcomed into my own kitchen. Here, I decided when to rise, when to speak, and when to simply be. The first Monday in my new life, I walked into a small pottery studio 3 blocks from the ocean. The space smelled faintly of clay and warm kilns, the air humming with quiet concentration. The instructor, a woman with hair the color of snow and a laugh like bells, handed me a lump of earth and said, "Let it tell you what it wants to be." My hands, stiff at first, found a steady movement as the wheel spun. The clay rose and dipped under my touch, soft but strong, like life itself, I thought. On Wednesdays, I joined the library's book club. We met in a sunlit corner, our chairs in a circle, mugs of tea and coffee balanced on our knees. The group was a patchwork of lives: a retired school teacher, a widower who had once been a ship captain, a young mother trying to read her way back to herself. I found myself speaking up more than I expected, my voice certain in a way it hadn't been for years. Evenings were my favorite. I would set the silver teapot on the stove, its surface catching the last light of day, and listen to the gentle hiss of the water heating. The first pour was always for me. Sometimes I'd take my cup out to the balcony, the steam curling upward into the salt air. The sea shifted colors with the hour, pale blue, then indigo, then black, streaked with silver. The rose plant thrived here too. I'd moved it to the balcony rail where it caught both sun and breeze. Each new bloom felt like a quiet message. You are allowed to keep growing. One Thursday, I carried the teapot to the pottery studio. We'd finished class early, and the instructor had invited everyone to share tea before leaving. I poured for each person, the metal warm in my hands. They didn't know the story behind it. They didn't need to. In their smiles, I felt something that had been missing: belonging without condition. Weeks turned into months, each day stitched with small acts that felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. I learned how to shape a bowl that could hold more than soup. It could hold a memory. I learned which chair on the balcony caught the perfect angle of the setting sun. I learned that I could wake up in the middle of the night and not feel the sharp edge of loneliness, only the soft space of solitude. The phone rang a few times in those early weeks. I didn't always answer. When I did, the conversations were short, polite. Mark's voice was measured, Lila's almost non-existent. I didn't ask about the house, and they didn't ask about me. One evening, Evelyn joined me for tea. She sat in the balcony chair opposite mine, her scarf fluttering in the wind. We didn't talk much, just listened to the waves. Before leaving, she touched the teapot and said, "You've made this your own again." I smiled. She was right. The teapot no longer felt like something I'd rescued. It felt like something that had rescued me. The book club chose a new novel about second chances, and in its pages, I found my own reflection. The pottery studio asked if I'd like to sell a few of my bowls at the summer market. I said yes, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see my work in the hands of strangers who might find comfort in it. Every night, as the silver teapot whistled, I felt the same truth settle in me. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, like steam curling from a cup, like a flower opening in the morning light. And I realized I wasn't just living alone. I was living. The call came just after dawn. I was on the balcony, cradling my first cup of tea, watching the horizon turn from gray to gold. The phone's vibration on the small table broke the stillness. I glanced at the screen. Lila. For a long second, I considered letting it ring out, but something in me wanted to hear her voice, if only to know which version of her I would meet today. I answered. "Naomi?" she said, her tone lighter than I expected, almost hurried. It's been a while. Yes, I replied. I let the word rest in the air. There was a pause, the kind that says someone is arranging their words carefully. Then, we need some help. It's about the house. We're having trouble with the mortgage, and Mark thought maybe you could. I stood, carrying the phone inside. The air in my apartment was warm, scented faintly of the rose plant blooming by the window. The house, I said? The one I sold? She exhaled sharply. Yes, but you know the new owner, right? Julia? Maybe you could talk to her for us. Ask her to give us more time. Her voice had that old undertone, the assumption that I was still part of their safety net, the unspoken belief that I would step in, no matter how they'd stepped on me before. I set the teacup down, the silver rim catching the morning light. Lila, I said gently, it's not my house anymore, and it's not my place to negotiate for you. She went quiet. Then, with a little edge, so you're just going to let us figure it out ourselves? After everything? I leaned against the counter, my fingers brushing the cool handle of the teapot. Yes, I said, because it's your life to figure out, not mine. There was a sharp breath on the other end, as if she was about to protest, but I spoke first. I hope, I told her, that you and Mark find somewhere that truly feels like home, a place you earn and keep, because it matters to you. The silence after that was long enough for me to hear the faint call of gulls outside. Then she said, almost to herself, "That's cold." "Maybe," I answered softly, "or maybe it's warm in a way you'll understand later." She didn't reply. The line went quiet, then disconnected. I stood there for a while, the phone still in my hand, the morning light now spilling across the floorboards. My heart wasn't racing. There was no satisfaction in denying her, only a calm certainty that I'd spoken the truth. Out on the balcony again, I lifted my cup. The sea was brighter now, restless but beautiful. I thought of the years I'd confused love with rescue, and rescue with sacrifice. I thought of all the times I'd been told that family means giving until there's nothing left. Maybe that's the debate people will have if they ever hear my side of it. Some will say I should have helped, that blood is reason enough. Others will understand that love without boundaries isn't love, it's erosion. I touched the teapot's curved handle, warm under my palm. "May they find their home," I whispered, "and may I keep mine." Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn sounded, deep and steady. I imagined Lila hearing my words replay in her head. Not today, maybe not this year, but someday when the idea of a home meant more than walls and a mortgage. For now, the only thing I needed to do was pour the last of my tea and live the day in front of me. It was late afternoon when Evelyn knocked. I opened the door to find her standing there with a bundle of roses in her arms. Not store-bought roses. These were from the garden. My garden. Their stems were still dotted with leaves, some petals curled by the sun, others just beginning to open. The scent reached me before her voice did. "I thought you might like these," she said. Her eyes were warm, but there was something else there, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been taken and what I'd chosen to reclaim. I stepped aside, letting her in. She set the roses gently on the kitchen counter beside the silver teapot that had traveled with me through every move, every season. "They're from the far corner," she explained, "by the old stone wall. I remembered you said those were Daniel's favorite." I brushed my fingers over the petals. They were the exact shade he'd loved, soft blush at the edges, deepening to crimson in the heart. For a moment, I saw him again, kneeling in the soil with the sun on his neck, his hands steady even in the wind. We made tea, the way we always used to when the world felt too sharp. I poured the water slowly, listening to the gentle hiss as it met the leaves. The scent mingled with the roses, filling the room with something that felt like both past and present. Evelyn sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her cup. We didn't talk about the party, or the house, or the call from Lila. Some things don't need revisiting. They've already done their work. Instead, we talked about the sea, about how the light changes in winter, turning the water to silver, about the pottery class I'd joined, and the book she'd just finished. Simple things, the kind that build a day without erasing the years before it. After she left, I found myself alone again with the roses. I trimmed their stems and placed them in a tall glass vase. Then, I set the vase on the small table by the balcony door, where the sun could reach them in the morning. Beside it, I placed the silver teapot. The two objects caught the light in different ways, one alive and breathing, the other steadfast and unchanging. I stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness settle in my bones. The voices of the past week, Mark's indignation, Lila's half-plea, the whispers at the party, faded into something distant, like a tide pulling away from shore. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was something quieter, steadier, the kind of truth you don't have to defend. In the distance, the sea moved under the setting sun, its surface rippling gold. A gull passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the balcony floor. I poured one last cup of tea. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of leaves and something sweeter, maybe the roses, maybe just the peace of knowing the day belonged to me. I took the cup to the balcony, sat down, and let the light sink lower. Somewhere in the city, Lila might still be replaying my words. Somewhere in that house, Julia might be arranging her own life among the walls I once called home. And here, in this small apartment by the water, I was arranging mine. I lifted the cup in a small private toast, to Daniel, to the garden, to the years behind me, and to the years still waiting. May they find their home, and may I keep mine.